Prokofiev's classical symphony is really a sophisticated and humorous 20th century comment on the great symphonies of Haydn and Mozart. Nevertheless, because of its brevity and sharpness, it is a perfect work through which to gain an insight into classical form in general and the sonata form in particular. The sonata form follows in music Aristotle's dictum with respect to the drama. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. In the first part, called the exposition, the composer presents his musical ideas or themes. In the second part of the movement, he plays around with some or all of the themes in a free fantasy. He develops them, and this section is known, therefore, as the development section. It serves to show off the ingenuity of a composer in extracting the most novel aspects from his thematic material. After these new approaches are sufficiently utilized, the composer then embarks upon the recapitulation, that is, the third part of the three-part form. In it, he presents a review of all of the themes of the exposition in their original sequence. But now, because of their variations in the development section, they take on the freshness of familiar friends settled back in their accustomed way of life. That is a short outline of the sonata form. The first movement of Prokofiev's classical symphony is in sonata form. It begins with a two-measure fanfare, a brilliant arpeggio in D major. This is not part of the first theme. It is rather an announcement to the audience that the main body of the work is about to begin, similar in function to the stylized prologue of an Elizabethan comedy. The first theme is announced immediately after this fanfare. It is a sparkling phrase that surprisingly ends in a key in which it did not begin. But the phrase is repeated, and the music lands back in the original key. This first theme is followed by a new thematic element stated in the flute, then in the oboe, and then in the bassoons and cellos. Together, the entire section sounds like this. In sonata form, this is called a bridge section. That is, it is a connective passage between two main themes. Prokofiev's bridge section leads immediately to the main second theme, which is characterized by bold leaps in the melody. Prokofiev writes in his score at this point, con eleganza, a perfect description of the theme. An almost conventional musical close, known technically as a cadence, leads to the third and concluding theme of the exposition, made up of triumphant scales and arpeggios, proclaiming the end of this section of the movement. The cadence. This is the third theme. Although it takes no more than a minute and a half to play, Prokofiev's exposition is a perfect model of a classical exposition, with a first theme, a bridge theme, a main second theme, and finally a third and concluding theme. The artistic function of the development section, as you will recall, is to present interesting variations on those themes, appearing in a free fantasy. Prokofiev's development, which is minute in scale, like the entire movement, starts off with an announcement of the first theme in minor. Followed by allusions to the bridge theme in different voices of the orchestra. Next we hear a development of just one portion of the first theme. And the bold leaps of the second theme. Now these leaps in a syncopated rhythm. And finally a literal repetition of part of the concluding theme. That is the end of the development section, and we are ready for the recapitulation, which, like the exposition, will start with the first theme. However, Prokofiev introduces it, as he did in the exposition, by the two-bar fanfare which opened the movement. With the appearance of the bridge theme, we are now launched upon the rest of the recapitulation. You will remember that the function of the recapitulation is to repeat all the themes of the exposition in their original sequence. Prokofiev does that, but he shortens the material slightly. He ends, as he should, with the arpeggios and scales of the concluding theme, but as a kind of third pillar, to complete the perfect symmetry of the form, he adds to it the triumphant two-bar fanfare which opened the movement, introduced the recapitulation, and now closes the movement. The second movements of most 18th century symphonies, in order to provide contrast, were slower and more lyrical than the fast, brilliant opening movements. They were also in a simpler form, a so-called three-part song form, consisting of one extended melody followed by a contrasting middle section and then a re-announcement of the opening melody. Prokofiev's second movement is constructed on this traditional formula. A short four-measure introduction sets the delicate mood. The main melody is announced in a high register by the violins. The melody comes to rest with an equally delicate cadence. The middle section is constructed on a passage in which fast chords played on the plucked strings, a technique known as pizzicato, set an ethereal dancing mood. As this dancing theme appears in other instruments of the orchestra, it gets louder. And is followed by a lyrical phrase in the high winds. But before we realize it, we are back at the first theme, and with it, the third part of the three-part song form. After the cadence brings the main theme to a close this second time, the strings repeat the material of the introduction. And the movement fades in a cavalier manner into nothingness. The traditional form of the third movement of most 18th century symphonies was a minuet, a vestigial leftover from the dance suites of the preceding century. In the symphonies, the minuet was followed by a second minuet known as a trio, which in turn was followed by a literal repetition of the first minuet. Prokofiev follows the outlines of this 18th century form, but instead of the minuet, he chose a different stately 17th century dance, the gavotte. The first statement of Prokofiev's gavotte is vigorous and, as he indicates, pesante, or heavy. As a trio, Prokofiev uses another 17th century dance, the musette, a dance which was always characterized by a drone bass, such as is associated with bagpipes. Prokofiev achieves the bagpipe effect by repeated chords in the violins, cellos, and timpani, and a sustained note in the other strings. Over this, he announces the light theme of the musette in the woodwinds. Just a touch of the humorous and grotesque 20th century Prokofiev is apparent in the repetition of the otherwise 17th or 18th century gavotte. Instead of the vigorous orchestration of its first appearance, Prokofiev, upon its repetition, gives the theme pianissimo to the flutes. And with a kind of impertinent flick, he ends the movement with light pizzicato chords of the strings. The sprightly finale, like the first movement, is in strict sonata form. It commences immediately with the bouncy first theme. A series of repeated notes introduces the second theme. The third and concluding theme is light and dancing in character, but is followed by loud, vigorous scales which proclaim the end of the exposition. The development section of this movement, though shorter, is more complex than that of the first movement. It starts off with the third theme appearing alone in the clarinet. This is joined by other instruments answering in imitation before the first phrase is finished, a musical device known as canon. Together with their effervescent accompaniment, those canon-like appearances of the third theme sound like this. Now we hear an allusion to the first theme, a reminder of the second theme. The repeated notes of the second theme continue. That concludes the short development section, and we are ready for the recapitulation. Prokofiev adds variety to this by giving the first theme not to the violins, which announced its original appearance in the exposition, but to the flute. The recapitulation is an almost literal repetition of the exposition. Toward the end of it, however, instead of a simple statement of the dance-like third theme, he enriches its final appearance by canon-like imitations. Only after this last evidence of his remarkable craftsmanship does Prokofiev repeat the flourishing scales which closed the exposition. This time he continues them to the very highest register of the violins to form this brilliant close to the movement and the delightful symphony as a whole.